It all started with a very simple idea. Tell the stories of how successful middle market CEOs made it to the corner office. I'm Brant Handley, founder and managing director of Resource Options International, or ROI. We're the USA's premier executive search firm focused exclusively on empowering middle market companies to attract, hire, and retain A players while transforming top executives' careers and lives. ROI's Into the Corner office is dedicated to discovering how middle market CEOs advance their career, and we're making these remarkable and sometimes quite unbelievable stories available to you for the very first time. Listen and learn about the challenges they've overcome, the interesting people they've met along the way, and the lessons learned that steered these executives' unique journey into a middle market corner office of their own. I know you enjoy these CEO stories as much as I've enjoyed recording them. So thank you for listening today. And if you like what you've heard, rate us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm looking forward to you joining me on the next great middle market CEO adventure into the corner office. Today, my guest is Jeff Bell, past CEO of LegalShield. LegalShield is North America's largest legal subscription service for households and small business. Jeff grew that business from a $650 million valuation in 2014 to over $2.4 billion in 2022 when he retired. Jeff now serves as the operating partner on the MidOcean Partners private equity investment team, and prior to LegalShield, Jeff served as the Microsoft corporate vice president for Xbox. He is known for launching Halo 3, Gears of War, Rock Band, and Netflix on Xbox Live. He spent 5 years at DaimlerChrysler as the vice president and general manager of Chrysler and Jeep divisions, where he is credited with the development and launch of the Jeep Rubicon, the four-door Wrangler, as well as the Chrysler 200, among others. Jeff served at Ford Motor Company for 12 years, where he started his career, including as managing director of Ford Spain. He currently serves on the board of his alma mater, Johns Hopkins-SAIS, and has served on the Kenyon College and National Multiple Sclerosis Board of Trustees. Jeff Bell, welcome into the corner office.
Thank you. Thank you so very much, Brant.
Great to have you today. Where does the podcast find you today?
I am in Kirkland, Washington, outside of Seattle.
Ooh, up in the beautiful Pacific Northwest. Getting warmer up there now, spring sprung?
This week is going to be tremendously sunny and warm, and so it is that time of year when everybody loves the Pacific Northwest and forgets about any of the rain.
I love it. I love it. Well, tell us about your early years. I don't think you grew up there, but let's hear a little bit about your early life and what was growing up where you did.
No, I'm a Okie from Muskogee. I was born in 1962 in Oklahoma City. Both of my parents graduated from the University of Oklahoma, and I was born 2 years after they were married. My dad was a journalist major from the University of Oklahoma. My mother did education and became a school teacher, and in many ways my life was idyllic. My parents loved each other. They loved me, and 5 years after my birth, my younger brother Greg was born. So
nice. Just the two of you? Any sisters or other siblings?
No, just Greg and Jeff.
Got it. What kind of work did mom and dad do?
So my father, Gerald Mayall Bell, who was born in Guthrie, he was originally in public relations. And honestly, he tried to work in a corporate environment in public relations. We moved away from Oklahoma to Ohio, Dayton, Ohio. We lived in Centerville, and it just wasn't his thing. And so he started his own business, which originally was called Bell Public Relations. He worked on school board campaigns and elections and whatnot, but that became Bell Publicom as he pivoted and continued to add more services to trade associations, professional societies. My mother was a school teacher. She really loved to teach kids to read. She taught me to read, and she was a teacher in the Centerville school system for many years and then became sort of a super sub.
Got it. Cool. What kind of things do you remember growing up? Any specific inspirations or influence that mom and dad had over you?
Well, when I think about my parents, I don't know if they specifically articulated their desire that I should have a better life than they had. I think it was implicit. I'm eighth generation Bell. 8 generations ago, James Bell came over from Scotland to North Carolina, and the rest is an interesting a story from Ancestry.com. Again, that's an amazing company. But they were both, my mother and father, the first in their families to go to 4-year university. Their
Wow.
parents had gone to Oklahoma City Teachers College, which was a 2-year associate degree. My family, both sides, has been very active in education. My brother, in fact, is a teacher, a former football coach at the high
Hmm.
school where I graduated in Centerville, Ohio. But I would say that they felt like family and faith mattered, and that we had dinner every evening together as a family, a lot of open communication. There was a belief that if you worked hard, you could have a good and solid life.
Hmm.
My folks were very active in our church, and my father was involved in political activities, campaigns, as I mentioned before. And so I think being a good citizen, being active in the community was very much a lesson that I learned growing up.
Was there a broader family around you? Did you have uncles and aunts and grandparents and such as well that were involved in your early childhood?
It's interesting because in Oklahoma, really all of our family were there. And when my father had this offer to move away, it was in fact sort of an unusual and a first. And I will say that that is something that influenced me because it gave me the belief that it was okay to try new things, to travel and explore. And I think my mother would have been equally happy staying in Oklahoma, but she too has enjoyed traveling and learning. And I would argue that as a consequence, both my parents influenced me to become a lifelong learner.
Hmm. That's cool. That's great. Were you a good student in school?
I was, I was a good student from the very beginning. I started in kindergarten in Montessori and have memories of learning about empathy and sharing leadership roles, being a good leader and being a good follower. My mother always felt that I could do better, and if she was always very encouraging, but if she ever criticized me, it would have been that I was an underachiever.
She kept raising the bar,
She
huh?
was a little bit, but with that said, I was National Honor Society and I had a high enough grade point average to be accepted into Kenyon College in Ohio. And I would say that I was always more prone to enjoy, humanities, the English, the history, civics, and probably wasn't as dedicated to science and mathematics as a younger and high school student.
Yeah, got it. Back in those high school and junior high years, involved in other things. You mentioned that your brother was a coach. Were you involved in sports or outside music, theater, debate, those kinds of things?
Interestingly, my father was encouraging to be part of YMCA Indian Guides. I think it's now
Hmm.
called Y Guides. And this is an organization that honors Native American traditions and facilitated outdoor experiences. And that was a wonderful thing that we did together. And then as soon as I turned 11, I joined Boy Scouts. My father had been an Eagle Scout, and I enjoyed going to the summer camps and the weekly meetings and earning merit badges and just learning about a lot of elements within nature as well as leadership. You become a patrol leader, and I was the troop leader ultimately, and I earned the designation of Eagle Scout myself. And as I got to high school, then I started playing football in the third grade. So I
Okay.
just kept playing football in high school. I wrestled, I played baseball. I was in a rock band with one of my very best friends, and I sang and played keyboards, and I fancied myself a songwriter, and I was in the ski club, wrote for the school newspaper and the yearbook. So it was a wonderful and holistic experience for me.
What about entrepreneurial activities? You certainly have exhibited that through the course of your career, which we'll get into in a moment. But any things when you were younger? Did you have the ubiquitous, paper route or sell Christmas cards at Christmas time and that kind of stuff?
You nailed it. My first job was selling flower seeds door to door in my
Flower
neighborhood.
seeds.
And
Ah,
and so, but then I did sign up to become a paper boy when the next route became available, and it wasn't in my immediate neighborhood, but in an adjacent neighborhood, and I did that for 3 years. One of the things I learned is that as I got to know the families to whom I delivered papers, I also asked if they needed someone to cut their grass, mow the lawn, to earn additional money, and that turned out to be a very important summer job for me. I ended up doing probably a dozen different lawns in addition to having the paper route.
And was that money that was kind of, earmarked for college? Did mom and dad allow you to, pursue some vices with that? Where did some of that, those earnings go during those years?
It was, I ultimately, what I recall, I remember buying a certificate of deposit of $1,000,
Wow.
and then that was my savings from all of my jobs. And then when I did go to college, my parents said, it's now time to go back and to cash in on that CD, and this will be sort of your money to expend while you're at college. And so it worked out fine. And the other thing I recall, moving it forward a little bit, is I received a scholarship from Beta Theta Pi. I was in a fraternity and was the president of the fraternity, and I received a scholarship for leadership. And I told my dad, hey, here's some money to go for my education. And my father said, son, this was in honor of you. This is your money.
Mm,
Do with it as you
nice.
wish.
Nice. Well, sounds like it was a foregone conclusion with mom as a teacher that you'd go on to college, given both parents had that. How did you pick Kenyon? And tell us a little bit about your experience there.
Well, yes, you're right. I mean, my parents really valued education. And it's a funny story because when I first was looking at college, I didn't know Kenyon College existed. Quite frankly, I wasn't really particularly focused upon small colleges. I was looking at the University of Michigan, Indiana, Miami of Ohio. And one day, well, and quite honestly, I did apply to Cornell and Dartmouth because Dartmouth in particular, there was a high school graduate who had come back. He had played football. He played football at Dartmouth, and he had talked about it and encouraged me, given that I had a high grade point average, to apply. But in both cases, I was denied admission. Uh,
Oh,
but my head coach, Bob Gredd, God rest his soul, I remember he yelled, Bell, get in here. First time I'd ever been called into the head coach's office. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. We were all intimidated.
your tail's going between your legs very quickly, I'm sure on that one.
Exactly. So, I rush into his office and he says, it looks like the head coach of Kenyon College wants to meet the smartest player on the team. And I think that's you. And so he kind of thrust this letter at me,
Wow.
and it was just an introduction. It said, would you like to come and visit the college and potentially, play on our football team? And when I arrived at Kenyon, it was a wonder. It was like Harvard and Oxford rolled into one. It
It's a
had
cool space. Yeah.
yeah, buildings from the 1850s, rough-hewn stone. They look like castles. It has a dining hall that looks like it's out of the Harry Potter movies. And I just fell in love with it. And I was confident that I could play football, and I did want to play more football. And as it turned out, I did start, all 4 years, and it was part of a wonderful experience where the team had had a losing record for some time. We had a losing record my freshman and sophomore year, but both my junior and senior year, we had not only winning records, but we were co-champions my senior year of the North Coast Athletic Conference. And so that was just an incredibly elevating and educating experience for me.
What'd you study there?
I studied history and Spanish.
Hmm.
And, for history, it was really the history of ideas, not so much dates and battlefields, etc. And that's something that I've continued to enjoy throughout my life for the last 20 years. Four of my very best friends from Kenyon and I get together annually, and, we discuss classics, quite frankly, classic authors, whether it's, Friedrich Nietzsche or Plato. And we do that in various locations. And we've also invited a retired professor who was one of our teachers to join us for the last decade or so, and just recently returned from Tucson, where we visited
Wow.
him and where he's retired, and discussed Homer's Odyssey.
What was that first job that you took coming out of college? Because it doesn't sound like it was in history and Spanish, from what I could gather.
No, and again, one of the things when you go to a liberal arts school is that, again, my family and my family friends would always ask me, well, what are you going to do with a history degree? Teach, And at first, I will say I kind of bristled at that question because it was very consistent, and yet over time, certainly by the time I graduated, I would just say yes,
Hmm.
because I think it was the initial idea of what I believe to be true, that teaching is leading. And that is true whether you're in a classroom or you're in the role of a CEO or anywhere in a leadership position, that teaching is leading. But I was a history and Spanish, and I took a class in American foreign policy, and quite frankly, I did it out of curiosity. And I
Yeah.
didn't know when I took that class that I would, in fact, apply to become a foreign service officer at the U.S. Department of State. But that's what I did when I graduated. I
Nice.
worked at the El Salvador desk, Central American office, U.S. Department of State. I ultimately decided not to pursue a career in the Foreign Service, mainly because it was very laudable, but it wasn't
Mm.
particularly entrepreneurial. And I decided that if I wanted to be a U.S. ambassador, I should just go out and be a successful businessman and try to become an ambassador as a political appointee.
Right. So you went back and got your MBA, is that right, before you got back into business?
Yes, I did. So when I went to DC, I had a scholarship that Kenyon had given me for American studies, and I was looking to use that in American foreign policy studies, some type of international relations. And I was reading about Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, where I ultimately went, but I looked at Princeton and at Tufts. I was also at the time working, and it was very clear that my lack of discipline and commitment to math and science had led to a deficiency in quantitative methods, which are important in business. I mean, you need
Mm.
to understand numbers. And so I was also looking at MBA programs, Harvard, Chicago. I looked at the University of Pennsylvania Wharton School. And what I found was that Johns Hopkins and Wharton had an MA MBA program. You had to apply separately, but if you were accepted, you could do 3 semesters at each institution and receive 2 master's degrees. And so
Mm.
I did it sequentially, starting with Johns Hopkins, and then we moved to Pennsylvania, to Philadelphia, and I finished at Wharton. And that's where I received various opportunities and decided to join Ford Motor Company when I graduated from Wharton.
And we talked about that the other day. It was my son's first job as well. Great company, great training ground. And did you come in a business capacity, or what were some of the first jobs you had there?
So it was a program called the Marketing Leadership Program, and I started at the same time as Mark Fields. And Mark was a friend and a colleague, and we grew up together at Ford Motor Company. And he ultimately became the chief executive officer of
Right.
Ford and was extremely successful at Ford, I believe having the highest profitability for his 3 years as CEO. But it was a program that wanted to help Ford change from being a finance-driven manufacturing company to being a consumer-driven marketing company. And so it was an opportunity to work in various areas. I would say it was like a training program. I worked in customer satisfaction and quality. I worked in product development. I worked in financial services. And I really grew up working in all these different areas, including being a regional manager in the Northeast. And I had said when I joined Ford, boy, I speak Spanish. I would love to
Hmm.
serve overseas. And it was something that Ford absolutely embraced. They said, after 5 to 7 years of learning the business, you can get a posting overseas. And sure enough, literally on my 7th anniversary, my family and I moved to London, and I was the head of European rental, remarketing, and fleet. And after that, became the director of Central European operations. And then they asked me, hey, you speak Spanish. Would you being the managing director of Ford Spain? And the answer was yes.
How soon?
Exactly. And so we moved to Madrid and spent 3 years also there. And that was a tremendously formative part of my career. I was 37 years old, and it was just fantastic to have both a profit and loss, and to work with unions and have public relations and press activities, the dealer body for the distribution of our vehicles, parts, and service. Just a very comprehensive experience, and just tremendous growth for me personally and professionally.
Very interesting how your early interest in international diplomacy actually turned into an international business career. In that
Yes.
regard. Yeah.
Yes.
Do you remember the first time you started managing people?
Yes, I would say that early on, when I was at a company called William S. Bergman Associates in Washington, D.C., before I went back to graduate school, I would say that between Bill Bergman, who was an entrepreneur, even at State Department, and I would say even football coaches, my observed leadership was most people were sort of authoritarian, do this, do that. But what I learned as a young manager, especially at Ford Motor Company, is that would not be an effective approach. Partly because I was so young and I was being given significant responsibility, including managing people that were more than twice my age. I learned that people don't care what you have to say until they know that you care. Let me go even further. Earning people's trust is job one. I'm using a little Ford pun there because they said quality was job one. I'm going to say trust is job one. Then you can begin to discuss, the objectives for the team, how each person contributes to those objectives, and then how we're going to work collectively to succeed. And that's something that I've tried to carry forward from Ford to Chrysler to Microsoft and even to LegalShield.
Now, that's kind of an interesting career progression we want to cover as well, because you were about a dozen years at Ford, made the Jersey change to go to DaimlerChrysler. Was that a difficult thing to do, particularly given the competitive nature of the big three at the time?
What I would say is yes. It's more common now, and most of the automotive leadership, certainly among the Japanese manufacturers and the Korean manufacturers in the United States, have started their careers in Detroit for GM, Chrysler, or Ford. But at that time, it was a big deal. And in fact, it was somewhat of a tension between Jack Nasser, who was CEO at Ford, and Dieter Zetsche at Chrysler, because I wasn't the only one that moved over to DaimlerChrysler. I was recruited by two executives that had already made that move. And then I myself probably brought over a half a dozen of people that I had worked with and wanted to work with still over at Chrysler, and that caused some friction, and so things settled down. But it was an opportunity for me to do what we wanted to do at Ford, but we never were successful in doing, and that was really focusing upon brand. Dieter Zetsche, when I met him for the first time, told me, I believe in brands, and we need clarity on what is Dodge, what is Chrysler, what is Jeep, and then fulfill that brand promise with great products and experiences. And that's exactly what I wanted to do at Ford, which is still a great company, please don't get me wrong, but it had run into a difficult time. When I returned from Europe, the U.S. operations were in disarray, and there wasn't really a vision of how to turn it back around. And then this one came about, and I enjoyed it quite a bit.
Now, the big career pivot, right, both from a Midwestern location to your beautiful Pacific Northwest to Microsoft. Tell us about that, because you don't find too many automotive industries for as long as you had been in it to go into technology.
Well, one of the things people would ask me is, wow, how could you go from automobiles to Microsoft or specifically to Xbox? That must have been radically different. And the truth is, both cultures are based upon engineering and sales. At Microsoft, that engineering was Bill Gates and the sales was Steve Ballmer. And that continues to be part of the culture. I would say that Satya Nadella has really changed it for the better. But certainly in automotive, it's engineering and sales. Now, when sales are at their best, marketing has a very significant role. And when engineering is at its best, I would argue, again, marketing with the voice of the customer is a big part of it. So making that transition for me culturally wasn't all that difficult. And as it turns out, Xbox needed to have it was a turnaround. That's the best way that I can put it. It had lost a lot of money in its first generation, and I had done a lot of I had a nickname when I was at Ford, less so at Chrysler, but I was sort of known as Rambo. Drop me into a bad situation and I would try and fix it, and then move on. And I thought that Xbox new brand, growth brand, exciting new category would be a different type of experience for me. But quite frankly, it was something that I was very familiar with. It needed to be financially re-engineered as a console, as a Xbox Live service. It needed a broader vision of how to engage a mass audience. And so it was a fantastic opportunity. I would say that I'm probably best known for amplifying the offering with an Xbox family, the Xbox Core, and then the Xbox Elite to give different hardware experiences to different segments. And then the launch of games. We really changed the way that we launched games when I was there. We treated them like movie launches, meaning we told the story. What people were exposed to wasn't just, oh, look at this gameplay. And I'm still fascinated when some games are launched and all they do is show how the game is being played. That's for the hardcore. And what really makes people excited about playing games, especially new people, broader audiences, what's the story? And the stories are there. Let me give you a modern day affirmation. When you look at the television series Fallout, which is a video game, or prior to that, The Last of Us, which was a video game, clearly these are very significant stories. And that story needs to be told when you launch the game. At least you have to give a hint at what is coming. Who are the characters? What's the conflict? And what is the context? And when we did that with Gears of War, it just changed everything. It was a massively successful advertising launch. The game sold 7 times more than forecast, and it really put Xbox back into a leadership position over Sony in terms of game sales and console sales for the time that I was there. And of course, that was followed by Halo 3, which was one of the greatest launches in video game history, and ended up winning the Titanium Lion Award at the Cannes Advertising Festival the year it was launched.
Awesome. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. We mentioned this in the introduction to PPLSI, or more commonly known as LegalShield. Again, interesting career pivot. You spent a little bit of time in between the entertainment business. I know you spent some time at NBC Universal, but what attracted you to that first CEO position? Again, recruited into it. Were you doing some advisory work for them? How did you kind of connect with PPLSI and take on that first CEO role?
Well, MidOcean Partners took the company private in 2012, which is a significant lift, I will say, taking a company from public to private. But they saw that this was a diamond in the rough, and they had operated it with a new CEO that had followed a 40-year founder by the name of Harlan Stonecipher, an incredible American entrepreneur, a very success story.
And just to get the years right, and this kind of astounded me, LegalShield was established back in the 70s, wasn't it?
In the 70s by Harlan Stonecipher, and he did all the heavy lifting. I mean, it was hand-to-hand combat to get this idea of you can pay $20 a month and have unlimited access to a law firm in your state, or in Canada in your province. And he had to do that state by state, province by province. He had to win over the attorneys general. He had to get this approved originally by insurance commissioners. So it was a lot of hard work, and he was an incredible success story. I didn't immediately follow him. There was an interim CEO, and things did not go as well. And I've got to be honest, that's a tough act to follow, a founder after 40 years. Yeah. When I started in 2014, indeed, part of what I observed is that maybe too much changed too fast for the culture. And there was a lack of productivity, a lack of revenue growth, and some of it just, there wasn't good connectivity with both the employees as well as with an independent sales force and with the market at large. And so I was absolutely enamored with the opportunity. It was a leadership opportunity. I had been a general manager in corporate environments. I'd worked with startups, but to be a CEO, it was everything that I really had dreamt it would be, both in the good and the bad. And I leapt at it immediately. And so it was something that I wanted to do. And boy, what an incredible ride.
How would you say that, in those first few years, and it's 10 years ago, right? I think 2014 is when you took over there. Yep. How would you say that your leadership, really changed and evolved in those first few years, particularly stepping into that first corner office?
Well, I would argue that when you're younger, there's an old adage that says you manage problems, but when you're older, you manage people. And clearly that is true as you go higher and the complexity increases. Early in my career, I solved problems through my people, but as I advanced, I spent all my time really coaching and developing people so that they could solve problems on their own and work with each other, because Systemic solutions are really important. It's very dangerous if, for instance, manufacturing is optimized, but it hurts sales. So
Right. Right.
you got to be careful about that. And then I would say that um, what you don't want, and I this kind of talked about earlier, authoritarian leadership styles. When you're a CEO, the last thing you need is a team of sycophants.
Hmm.
You need to have your strategy stress tested, by direct reports, and quite honestly, they're direct reports. The most successful businesses anticipate that however successful they are today, they're going to need to reinvent themselves sometime, and probably in the not so distant future. I mean, today we see how radically and quickly AI has influenced the environment. We
Yeah.
see, again, we relearn how dangerous inflation can be to an economy. So there are a lot of things that are not in the control of an individual CEO. So once you have your strategy, you do need to then do scenario planning. And this is another form of stress testing, just to make certain that, number one, you believe that this is a robust approach, and number two, you have scenarios that you've already anticipated that would tell you what's a doomsday scenario, like when we really have to hunker down and take drastic and difficult decisions. It's best to talk about those before you need to take them, if you don't mind my saying. And I would
Absolutely.
say that I've took a lot from Ken Langone, founder of Home Depot, and I remember him telling a tale where he said to his direct reports, "These are the rules of the game of business." He said to his subordinates that everyone that brings him a problem gets a point.
Hmm.
Everyone who brings him a problem and a solution gets 1,000 points. And whoever has the most points wins. So I
Wow.
think that this is a testimony that all CEOs don't want problems to be hidden from them. But boy, they love it when those problems come forward and there's already thinking around what potential solutions are to those problems.
Well said. I've heard it also said that it can be somewhat uncomfortable at times having your answers questioned rather than your questions answered as a CEO. Were you in that situation at LegalShield? And if so, how did you handle that?
Well, again, what I put in place something originally at Ford Motor Company when I went to Europe, and I had increasingly complex assignments, and I continued it when I went to Chrysler and to Microsoft. I call it the Focus Five. You've got to be sensitive to your stakeholders, and by that, really your owners of the business, your shareholders, for instance. You need to be sensitive to your employees, to your customers, to your suppliers and partners, and then also to your brand. And when you think about that matrix, you could see that, for instance, if you go too far in loving your employees, it could be at the expense of customer service.
Hmm.
If you put all of your eggs in the customer's always right, it might actually put a tremendous strain, even to the breaking point, for your suppliers and your partners. And there are some things that you might do if you only cared about maximizing return immediately, you could harm your brand. So you have to find a balance between these five elements, I have found. And this is just another form of, again, finding it's a healthy, balanced scorecard, but being able to sort of think about having, your answer, having your question, you're being questioned versus, having questions answered. That is a dynamic that I've always implemented, and I think that it is successful, and it invites people to raise concerns
Right.
between departments and for products and service launches as well as ongoing operations.
I know you've been committed to continuous learning, even though that wasn't stated, but with your mom as a teacher and all your Wharton MBA and of course the additional courses you've taken, how has you as a CEO found to be the most impactful executive development activity? We all need to keep our saws sharpened, and yet when we get to that, senior level, sometimes it's a challenge to find ways to do so. What did you do, and how have you continued to keep that saw sharpened, so to speak?
Well, I'm a big believer in personal leadership and team development.
Hmm.
And, everywhere I went, there was some type of assessment. Myers-Briggs is very famous. Microsoft used one that I simply called green, yellow, red, blue. But I like something called personality prints. And Paul Hertz Group down in Florida has a consultancy built around this. A personality print tells you what your subconscious motivations are as an individual. And then it tells you, for instance, what things will in fact make you inspired and most productive, and then what things will upset you, what triggers will potentially make you less productive and less, I would say, easy to work with. This is a good starting point because it is self-awareness, but the real power of an approach using any of these is to share them with others. Now, I've always shared my own personality print that shows you your best self. It also shows your shadow self. And I've had my direct reports and then their extended teams do this. I've done this with my board of directors. I have also done this with independent suppliers, partners, and sales channels. And why? Because it gets back to that point I made earlier about building trust and connection. Now, when you do this, it's best to have it facilitated and people learn how to communicate with each other, how to work best with each other. And I'm a big believer that for teams to be very strong, they've got to have that. They've got to have trust. And that includes demonstrating vulnerability, which I think is one of the greatest forms of courage. People have to connect on an emotional level to really trust each other. And listen, things are difficult in life for human beings, and in business, bad things happen. Okay, even if you have great people, I mean, there are challenges out there. Competition is fierce, and there can be unanticipated changes. So when the going gets tough, you need to make sure that people come together, and that there is a safe and trusted environment for people to say, hey, I've got a problem. Again, back to the point, never hide problems. Okay, that should move faster. Bad news faster than good news. Although if you have good news, you should celebrate it vociferously. I'll also give a shout out to Keith Ferrazzi, a good friend who has a company called Ferrazzi Greenlight that works with teams to help them towards a unified success, really working better together and going higher together. And I've used him at Chrysler, at Microsoft, and at LegalShield.
Love it. What do you look for when you're making bets on the people you invest in and hire?
Well, I would argue that it is important that you really appreciate diversity. And perhaps the best way to explain my own approach is that I like gen specialists. So many times when you think about the structure of a team, and again, I played football. I mean, obviously everyone doesn't play quarterback and everyone doesn't play, defensive tackle. So there are people that are experts in product development and experts in manufacturing and experts in sales and of different things. But I like people that also, I call them gen specialists, especially if they're going to be C-suite leaders of any of these specific areas. A CFO can't be just great at finance. They have to have both a human quality to be able to communicate and work well with others, but also just a general interest in business. And so I call that a gen specialist. And especially for the C-suite, I think that that's really important when we interview people, that we hire the expertise, but we also say, hey, is this a potential leader and maybe even someone that one day could be in the succession planning for the top job?
Yeah, great stuff. Well, we're just about out of time. We got a couple of last questions. You retired in 2022. We mentioned that. What's up for Jeff now? You're too young to retire, Jeff, and I know that for a fact. So what's keeping you busy these days?
So I'm working for MidOcean Partners as an operating partner, and I'm on their executive board for the private equity side, working with the portfolio companies and looking for new investment opportunities. I did retire in part for two very personal reasons. One, my mother, who just celebrated her 86th birthday, was diagnosed 2 years ago with Alzheimer's, and I needed to take time to get her set up correctly for her own health and safety. And then I also, too much football, I loved it, but this is one of the things. I had two badly damaged discs in my neck, and I had to have two discs replaced. And that changed my life. I had to get the surgery and then go through the rehab, of course, but I was having pain and especially numbness, peripheral neuropathy. And now that both of those things are settled, I've been so grateful to MidOcean, but I'm looking again. I love leading people, and I love helping people grow and be the very best that they can be. So maybe you'll have to have me back sometime.
I won't ask the question, but it sounds like there might be another CEO position in your future, not too distant. Last question, Jeff, before I let you go, and we ask this as well, our CEO guests. What career and life advice would you give to someone who, has their eyes on their own corner office someday?
Well, I do have a point of view on this question. Business is about creating new things and fixing broken things. Solve problems today and for the future. You got to raise revenue. Businesses have to increase their profitability. Make people confident and give them really meaningful assignments. Keep your perspective broad. Incorporate perspectives and the needs of all of the Focus 5. Those are the things that I would advise people. And understand that diversity is first and foremost one of perspective and opinion. It has to be encouraged in order to both recognize new opportunities for growth and success, but also as an acknowledgement that there are going to be potential issues that come up that you didn't anticipate. My final advice would be learn to embrace, and I mean truly embrace, the idea of being a servant leader. People don't care what you have to say, even if you have absolute power, unless they know that you care. Establish empathy and really be accessible and close to your leadership team, but also to all of your employees, to your customers, to your partners and suppliers. That would be the advice that I would give to people.
Jeff Bell is the past CEO of LegalShield, joins us from his beautiful home in the Pacific Northwest. Jeff, thank you so very much for sharing your journey into the corner office.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Into the Corner Office with Brant Hanley. We hope you enjoyed hearing our guest CEO story as much as we did. If you want to hear more CEOs reveal their journey into the corner office, please subscribe via iTunes and tell your friends and colleagues. For more information about Brant, Resource Options International, and the mighty middle market, visit www.goforroi.com. We look forward to having you join us for our next episode.